Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today I'm going to talk about heroes again. And if you've listened to my channel at all, you know that the reason I made this channel was to talk about heroes. I want to talk about X-Men in particular because the new X-Men movie is not very far away, the Jean Grey Dark Phoenix movie. So I thought I'd go back and watch the first X-Men movie. I thought maybe I'd watch them all, but I just watched the first one. And something happened when I watched this movie. I was actually listening to that little bit at the first where you have Jean Grey up in front of the Senate, basically fighting against the Mutant Registration Act. And then you have Senator Kelly actually championing the Mutant Registration Act. And I'm thinking to myself as I'm listening to both sides of this conversation, I've never heard this in this way before because I actually think I might be supporting Senator Kelly here. Because back, of course, when originally we watched the movie, nobody would support Senator Kelly. You were coming off of those books where Mutant Registration Act went horribly wrong and all that kind of thing. But when you watch it from a distance, which I did just recently, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, maybe Senator Kelly has a point. Maybe he really does. If you actually watch the movie, you'll see that all the people in the gallery are clapping, right? So the people want it. A lot of the senators don't want it, but the people seem to want it. And you can tell that it's an older movie now because, of course, the people clapping for it would include women and minorities and people of color and all that, which you would never get that in today's movies. But you had everybody clapping thinking, yeah, that's a good idea because Senator Kelly's actually making a good argument. Now, I'm not saying that I would 100% support it. Maybe I wouldn't. But at least I'm considering the fact right now. And the reason why I'm considering it now is because of the way today is right now and because of how heroes are today. And I want to talk about heroes and X-Men as heroes specifically because the thing is that when you have a hero, traditionally, again, I always talk about the traditional way that you have a hero. You have a superhero and a supervillain, right? You have a good guy and a bad guy. You have these two people that have superpowers, but one's good and one's evil. You got a hero and a villain. There's a really clear distinction there, right? The good guy does good. The bad guy does bad. Your hero is heroic. Your villain is villainous. If you go back to the ancient definition that for 3,000 years of our history would be that the hero is a paragon of virtue. And your villain, of course, is a person just filled with vice. And that would be your normal definition of the thing. So if you lived in this kind of a world, if you lived in the Marvel world, you know, there's a clear distinction. And I would say that you could boil that distinction down into the fact that you have a person with superpowers. If they use that power in order to do things which are self-sacrificial, that is to say, in order to help other people, that makes them a hero. Because, of course, you got to look at these heroes, right? They're not just giving up their time to be a hero. They're putting their life on the line almost every time they go out there. So yeah, they're being self-sacrificial. They're doing it to help other people. Whereas your villain, he's using his powers in order to be self-serving because he's just using them for himself. So there's your clear distinction between hero and villain, the good guy and the bad guy, right? It's fairly simple. But then you add mutants into the mix, and it's an interesting wrinkle because you know, a lot of people, a lot of different companies tried to imitate Marvel and their mutants. You know, in DC you have metahumans, you know, in Dark Horse you had your Next Men, and you know, and you had all these other companies trying to come up with their equivalent of mutants, and it never really worked. But it still worked in Marvel. And it worked in Marvel because I think of the way that it was written, more than just because you had people that were born with powers. And the way that it was written was very, very distinctive. And I'm saying this as an X-Men fan because my X-Men collection goes way back. You know, they have these new X-Men books coming out now, which are basically legacy books, which tell you all the stories from long ago. I don't need to be retold those stories. I remember those stories. I think, you know, I certainly don't have full runs as far back as this, but I think my collection starts at like number 24, where you still had your original X-Men. And they were just students with Professor Xavier. And I, you know, go through my X-Men and read X-Men all the time. Right up until the late 90s where I stopped buying comics. Until recently. But the thing was that with your X-Men, there was a reason why they were there with Professor X. And it's because Professor X wanted to teach them how to use their powers. And not just to use them, but to use them responsibly. There you got that word again, responsibility. Because you got it certainly in Marvel, just going right through with Peter Parker. With great power comes great responsibility, right? And you had Professor X, and he was there to teach these young mutants how to use their powers responsibly. And that's what he filled up his school with. That's what his school was for, to teach young mutants how to use their powers responsibly. And those things are tied up with very North American ideas, I would say. Very, very North American ideas. Because responsibility is a very individualistic idea, right? You have to take responsibility. That's a personal thing. And, North America, it is based upon this individuality. If you look at it academically, they would say it goes back to your frontier and your people on the frontiers where you had your musket and you're out there on your homestead and the only one you could depend on was you to defend yourself and your family. Stuff like that. And this has run straight through our culture in North America. Because it's not just America, it's North America. And there was this individuality that is still, I think, core in North American culture. And that's where that idea of responsibility, I'd say, comes from. You got to take personal responsibility. And the other thing that I would say that North America was built on was the idea, just ingrained sort of in the back of your mind that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's why people fled to the Americas, right? It was because you had this old world where you had corrupted power. And so in the new world, that idea was in everybody's mind, that power corrupts. And therefore, you can't have too much power in one person's hands. You have to take that power and distribute it among as many people as possible so that everybody has their own little bit of power. And again, personal responsibility is all tied up in that. And if you actually look at things like the documents of the Founding Fathers and their letters and their writings, they were building a country based upon personal responsibility, right? Everybody had to be personally responsible. You had to be just taught from your family that you needed to follow what was right and shun what was wrong and be personally responsible because you were given that power. That's what this entire country was built on, that you distribute the power among the people, right? So you got to take personal responsibility for that. So the thing was that in X-Men, you had that idea, just like in Spider-Man. Professor X was trying to teach them to be personally responsible for this power because, again, they had this great power and they didn't do anything to deserve it at all. They were just born with it. And therefore, they had to be taught this extra responsibility, if you would say, because they had great power. Not just some power, but great power, more than a normal person. Therefore, they had to be very, very responsible. They had to be heroically responsible. That's what he was teaching them. And that's what my X-Men, from the very beginning, all the way through when I stopped buying X-Men, that's what was going on. At the very least, when you had Professor X gone and you had them out in the outback and things like that, they were still heroes. They were self-sacrificing heroes. That was still ingrained in them. But today, the reason I would think that I would probably support Senator Kelly in his Mutant Registration Act is because that personal responsibility idea is gone. At the very least, in your comic books, right? In your idea of hero. And it's no mystery why, because you have social justice warriors writing these books, right? SJWs mean social justice warriors. They're socialist-minded people. And the whole idea of socialism is that you don't look at the individual. You don't look at the individual at all. You subject your individuality to the group, to the socialist group, to your little collective. And the reason for that collective is so that you can use all of your combined might in order to gain power. And I would say further that in order to gain power so that you don't have to take personal responsibility. So that you can have that power and use it in order to skip out on personal responsibility because you can do whatever you want. And that is very, very anti-New World, anti-North American, anti-American, certainly. this idea of socialism, because that's what socialism is based upon. It doesn't look at the individual at all. The individual it doesn't matter. The individual does not matter in socialism. That's why they can sacrifice individuals and not care. Because, of course, everything is about the collective. And the reason why the collective is there is to gain power. And once they gain that power, they can use that to skip out on any kind of personal responsibility. If you're looking at what I've been saying in the last week about identity politics and Sana Amanat trying to promote this through representation, that's the whole thing just playing out, because it plays out in a whole bunch of different ways, but that's just one of them. She's trying to have representation. That representation in identity politics is specifically there in order to gather people of the same identity group together so that they can use that grouping together to gain new powers, rights and privileges for themselves, which is power, so that they don't have to be responsible for themselves anymore. Again, these are the kind of people that are writing your comics now, your social justice warriors. And when they write comics, they're of course writing comics and characters in the ways that they see fit. That idea of personal responsibility, that idea of individuality is no longer there. You have these people with great power, like the mutants, who are just born with it. They just have it. And so they do whatever they want with it. You have this character in X-Men Red who, she's trying to use her power to get rid of the gender pay gap, which is basically she stole a bunch of money from people and gave it to people who didn't deserve it, because they didn't work for it. And you have Jean Grey, and she's not a hero anymore. She's a villain. I've done a number of reviews of X-Men Red and X-23 and a couple of things like that. These heroes, supposedly, quote-unquote heroes, they're not heroes anymore. They're becoming villains, and some of them already are villains, like Jean Grey. They are villains. And why? Because, of course, they have this power. And SJWs see the collection of power as a good thing, whereas your traditional idea of North America is that no, you can't have too much power in one person's hands. You got to distribute it. That's the good. That's how you do good. You distribute power among as many people as possible. And when there is collection of power in one person's hands, they got to be personally responsible, extremely personally responsible. You got to be a hero. You got to be virtuous. You got to be good. And I would say that, personally, I would say that everybody has that in them, and everybody should do that. Maybe it's just because I'm a comic book guy, I grew up with comic books, but, I would say that everybody is called to be a hero. You have that power to do so in your life, even in small ways. Everybody's called to be a hero. And it has to do with individuality and personal responsibility for little things, not just big things, but little things. I always think of, that old movie, I think it's Broadcast News. I can't remember what the name of it is. It had Michael Keaton and who was the other? Marissa Tomei. And they were married. They both worked at a newspaper. And she was pregnant, so she was off. And he kept ignoring her. And he said to her, well, I'm always going to be there. When something big happens, I'm going to be there, right? And she confronted him after a while and said, look, what happens then when someone comes to our house and puts a gun to my head and to the head of your newborn child and says, come home now or I'm going to kill them? And he looks at her and he says, that's never going to happen. And she goes, exactly. It's never going to happen. These giant, huge things are never going to actually happen for you to be there. If you want to be there, you need to be there in the little things. You need to be there in the small things. That's how you be there. And that's how you take responsibility. You got to take responsibility in the small things, right? And if you look at the people who write these comics, the SJWs, and the way that they behave, they take no responsibility for their personal actions. You look at them on Twitter, they're just fighting for their cause, and anything can be sacrificed for their cause. Anybody, too. They'll turn on anybody. And they will never take any personal responsibility for their actions whatsoever. And these are the people who are writing your comic books. And the most disturbing part of it is, I would say, is that these are the people who are creating what are supposed to be heroes and giving them out to the new generation to say, this is what a hero looks like. Someone who we, traditionally as comic book readers, would see as a villain. Anyways, If I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Give me something new to think about. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.